Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. This week, well, first off, thank you for listening. But this week we do a program which we really didn't anticipate doing. Part of me thought it would be better to just talk to Jefferson about gardens. But we didn't. We talked about January 6th, 2021.
An amazing, troubling, perplexing, sad, humiliating day in American history, and yet not all bad. I think we want to make this introduction brief. I merely want to say I hope people will sign up and participate in my course on the U.S. Constitution. I was thinking about it all yesterday and all today. Never have we needed sober, contextualized, humanities-based, historically solid conversation about the United States Constitution as much as we do right now. And so we're going to be doing the course again at the end of January and through February, 5 weeks, all Saturdays, and then office hours on Wednesday nights. There's room for plenty of people in several sections, but it turned out in the fall to be a very, very interesting online course, no exams, no final papers or anything. And if it was interesting in the fall, it's going to be really, really interesting in the spring. David, we have just lived through a couple of crises. We've been in a constitutional crisis. We had the first president in American history who has refused to engage in a peaceful transfer of power that led actually to a riot at the United States Capitol. We have the first attack on our Capitol since 1814. We're living in a time of really extraordinary, dramatic events, and it's not over yet. We recorded this today on the 7th of January, the day after all of that. This is the first little draft of a humanities and historically based attempt to understand it. We knew we couldn't do it on our own, so we called our friend Joseph Ellis. We called our friend Beau Wright, who lives in Lynchburg and was a member for a time of the Obama administration. And we called our Enlightenment correspondents out in the state of Washington, Mr. David Nicandri, and they were just all terrific.
They were all just great to talk to. Joe and Beau and David Nicandri, just brilliant.
He's so troubled. He texted me yesterday and he said, I never thought I would live to see this, that this is an unprecedented moment in my life. He's 70 years old. And he said in a text, and he repeated it in the program today, that when he thinks of other inflection points, moments in the timeline, he thinks of November 22nd, 1963, and of course, September 11th, 2001. And on September 11th, his concern was that the people on Flight 93 crashed that plane so that it would not strike the Capitol. I was deeply moved by that. And so I invited him to come on the program. And he said, that's not my best suit. My best suit is Enlightenment era exploration. But I think we both agree we're glad we got him on this subject.
Absolutely. And we are going to go to the show very shortly. But I do want to say we so appreciate your mail. We so appreciate those of you who decide to support the show. You can do so at jeffersonhour.com. Join the 1776 Club. You'll get access to all the shows and special bits like this conversation with David Nicandri.
We're going to try to go to Cuba in March, go to the Jefferson Hour site. It was one of the greatest life-changing experiences of my life last year. We think it's going to be all fine. Well, we know it is. And the question is, are there people who are eager for that cultural tour? Only a limited number of places. That's Cuba in March of 2021, and then the Lewis and Clark trip in the summer, and the River of No Return, a safe, wonderful, just hang on to the rope in the raft trip down the River of No Return, the Salmon River, talking about Lewis and Clark and key figures in American conservation. And I want to say one more thing as long as we're at this, and then we'll go to the show. I wrote that long book, 65,000 words, about the last month of the Trump era before the election, and I published it. It's called Donald Trump and the Death of American Integrity. And I wrote it, and it got to be a more serious thing than I thought. And towards the end, in like the last third of the book, I really tried to wrestle with what is it about the character of this extraordinarily talented, powerful, charismatic figure who has dominated our lives now almost every single day for the last 5 years, like no other president or public figure of my lifetime. And I thought during the whole period when I wrote that book, David, what am I doing this for? And, this thing is headed to its inevitable ending here. I'm now so glad that I did, because it was my attempt as a person who spent his life trying to understand history and the humanities to make sense of this phenomenon. And you keep hearing me, and we get some negative mail for this, but I regard Donald Trump as a political genius of a certain sort, and of one of the most monumental figures of our time, and that he must be taken seriously, and we must try to make sense of why he had that grip on a very significant portion of the American people. And they are people that have a deep concern about where this country is headed. And so we have to try to understand this, not just judge it. And so I'm really glad that I took that time, and I hope people will consider getting and reading the book, because towards the end, I really try to wrestle with what is it about this man? And so I feel that we're doing some of the best work of our lives here. And I'll tell you what, though, David, I will be so relieved on around February 1st when we can stop talking about one person for many years.
At the danger of making it sound like we're fighting each other for the last word, more Jefferson. We get that from our listeners a lot. And honestly, this week it was intended that we were going to talk to President Jefferson about his first inaugural speech, which is outstanding. And in fact, that program will air next week, followed by another program with Jefferson talking about his first cabinet. So please look forward to that. And with that, sir, shall we go to the show?
There'll be more Jefferson in the year 2021, interviews with other historians and people with interesting points of view. We take suggestions from our readers very, very seriously, and corrections and comments and praise. So thank you for being listeners. We're just weary. Before we started to record today, David, we both admitted that we are off our centers of gravity because of the crisis of the moment. And I think that the program that we have, that we're queuing up right now, is among the more important that we have done.
Assuming things don't change a lot between now and next Tuesday when it's posted.
Well, we have our virtual chances to get back together, but Happy New Year 2021. Let's cheer up, shall we?
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I am joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, we are recording this program on January 7th, 2021. The previous day is one that will be forever remembered in American history. We've already received many inquiries about yesterday's events from our listeners, and I thought it appropriate to get you to comment on what happened yesterday and how you feel about it, and maybe some historical perspective.
Let me say, first of all, that I am, I suppose you'd say, emotionally hungover today. When I began to watch the proceedings in the United States Senate, I was fascinated to see how what I assumed would be a sort of circus of political theater would unfold. But of course, within a very short time, something much more important occurred, and that was the attack by an angry mob on the Capitol building itself in Washington, D.C. And so let me start this way. This is the first time since 1814 that the United States Capitol has been assaulted. It was attacked by the British, and the city of Washington was burned. This time, the second time in American history that this has happened, the attack was by our own citizens, what we would call domestic terrorists. Jefferson might call them rebels. So that's pretty sobering that this happened yesterday, and I sat in complete disbelief as I watched this invasion of people who broke through the limited security at the Capitol and occupied it. And thank goodness none of them was possessed of a AR-15 or an assault weapon of any sort. It would not have surprised me at that point if there had been serious bodily harm to their perceived enemies. And at that point, one of their perceived enemies might even have been Mitch McConnell, who just a short time before had given what I think was the greatest speech of his career, urging a peaceful transition and urging Congress to do the right thing, which is to certify the election in the pro forma way that is expected. So that was pretty hard to accept. This is the first time in American history that a sitting president has refused to accept a peaceful transition of power. We've had 59 elections. Many of them have been hotly contested. Many of them have left people deeply disappointed and even bitter. Passions have run high. But in all of that time, there has never been a sitting president who refused to participate in a civil transfer of power from one administration to the next. And one step further, David, this is the first time in American history that a president has incited a riot, has incited a march on the Capitol of the United States. So all of those things are extremely grave. And in the long run, the actual attack, the physical attack on the Capitol building will be more symbolic than meaningful. The meaningful part of this was the breakdown of our constitutional republic that has precipitated a moment like January 6th, 2021.
You mentioned Mitch McConnell's speech. I know both of us listened to a great number of the speeches given yesterday and last night. McConnell called that speech the most important of his 36 years in the Senate.
We're debating a step that has never been taken in American history, whether Congress should overrule the voters and overturn a presidential election. I've served 36 years in the Senate. This will be the most important vote I've ever cast. The voters, the courts, and the states have all spoken. They've all spoken. If we overrule them, it would damage our republic forever. If this election were overturned by mere allegations from the losing side, our democracy would enter a death spiral. We'd never see the whole nation accept an election again. Every 4 years would be a scramble for power at any cost.
I urge everyone to listen to the entire speech. I think it was the greatest of his political career. I was stunned by it, frankly. And if you closed your eyes or just read a transcript, that speech could have been given by the most eminent law professors at the greatest universities in the United States. It could have been delivered by a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. It could have been spoken by a Democrat or the leader of a foundation dedicated to civil liberties. He did the statesman-like thing to suggest that we must have a peaceful transition. We must respect the votes of the American people. And he said that if we don't do that, if Congress refuses simply to do its ceremonial duty and certify the election, that this would bring about what he called a death spiral to America's Republican form of government. He could not have stated it more firmly. You could see the passion that he was trying to control as he spoke those words. It was a brave thing to do. It was in open defiance of some members of the United States Senate who were planning to make this a kind of political circus. I think it set the tone. And I think that McConnell's speech would have had a chastening effect even without the crisis that sobered everybody up later in the day.
As I said, I know both of us listened to a great number of the speeches that were given. Were there any others that really stood out to you?
Yes, a couple of them. Mitt Romney, predictably, was civil, eloquent, brief. He's really emerged as a constitutionalist. He said something that I think you have a recording of, and that is that the best thing that the Senate could do for those who are angry and discontented is to tell them the truth.
What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States. Those who choose to continue to support his dangerous gambit by objecting to the results of a legitimate democratic election will forever be seen as being complicit in an unprecedented attack against our democracy. That will be their legacy. For any who remain insistent on an audit in order to satisfy the many people who believe that the election was stolen, I'd offer this perspective. No congressional audit is ever going to convince these voters, particularly when the president will continue to say that the election was stolen. The best way we can show respect for the voters who are upset is by telling them the truth.
I thought it was a brave speech. I love his manner. He has a very assuring manner, and he's a man who has a conscience. You know, he's a very serious Christian, and he believes that conscience is character, and character is conscience.
I was really struck by Romney's speech as well, and I he was speaking before the entire Senate. It was a very, very moving moment.
I thought so too. There was one other speech that really struck me later in the day. It was by Senator Bennett of Colorado, and he likened our situation to the last years of the Roman Republic. And this strikes a special chord with me because of my own training in the classics. And as you know, I just taught a Constitution online course and will again for anyone who's interested at the end of January and through February. And one of the books we read was Cullen Murphy's book, Are We Rome? Asking whether we are going the way of the Roman Republic that broke down in the first century BC and then led to the empire, led to the first emperor, Augustus Caesar, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, and that was the end of the Roman Republic. And the question that we were wrestling with is, are we in the same deteriorated and fragile situation that leads to the breakdown of a noble republic? And what Senator Bennett said was that when we cease to debate and move towards street action, which of course is what Donald Trump incited yesterday, when street action and violence and the breakdown of law and private armies essentially replace the give and take of political discourse, that's when republics die. And so he was, I think, right on about this, that this is the first time that a president has incited an armed riot to keep himself in office and overturn an election. And that is precisely what occurred in Rome in the first century BC. So that struck me because it used to be Robert Byrd of West Virginia who was the historian in the United States Senate, and most of the debate yesterday was locked in the present. But I think Senator Bennett rightly reminded us that history may not repeat itself, but it echoes, and we are in some very dangerous ground here, and we need to see the sacking of the Capitol not as a spasmodic moment of violence, but in a much graver way, that when you start to enlist mobs to overturn due process, then you are really heading into that very death spiral that Mitch McConnell had been talking about earlier in the day.
Let's listen to just a portion of his speech right now.
One of the things I was thinking about today is something I often think about when I'm on this floor, which is that the founders of this country, the people that wrote our Constitution, actually knew our history better than we know our history. And I was thinking about that history today as we saw the mob riot in Washington, D.C., thinking about what the founders were thinking about when they wrote our Constitution, which was what happened to the Roman Republic, when armed gangs doing the work for politicians prevented Rome from casting their ballots for consuls, for praetors, for senators. These were the offices in Rome. And these armed gangs ran through the streets of Rome, keeping elections from being started, keeping elections from ever being called. And in the end, because of that, the Roman Republic fell and a dictator took its place. And that was the end of the Roman Republic, or any republic for that matter, until this beautiful Constitution was written. in the United States of America.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We're talking this week about the transition of power and the events that occurred yesterday, January 6th, 2021. Clay, did you have any further comments before we continue this conversation?
I do. Of course, I have hours of thoughts about this. I've been unable to sleep. I'm in a sort of a slightly off my center of gravity emotional state. I never thought that I would live to see a day like yesterday in the United States of America. And it just is a reminder to all of us that we are all complicit. There's been a vulgarization of American life. There has been increasing ad hominem attacks, the anonymity of people's postings. There is polarization that has been exacerbated by media, including sort of silo media that speaks to just one point of view. There's been a loss of civics education in this country. There has been a general loss of small r Republican understanding of what's at stake in a free society. And that really is a much more serious issue than the person who happened to be the demagogue at the center of that thing. I heard two really extraordinary comments last night, one by James Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, who worked for a time for President Trump. And he said, among other things, that the next 13 days, we're recording this on January 7th, 2 weeks before the inauguration, he said the next 13 days may be the most critical days of our lifetime. That really struck me. In other words, General Mattis was saying, watch carefully. This is the most critical time. And secondly, John Bolton, who was the national security advisor for a time for President Trump, spoke later. He was in a very irritable mood. I think we were all irritable by then. John Bolton said the most interesting thing. He said, well, first of all, listen carefully. We must do no harm. And the commentator didn't really understand what he was saying, but here's what he was saying. When you back somebody into a corner, you don't want to touch off some appalling incident. We don't want to precipitate a world crisis or some event that's hardly even imaginable. And so he said, do no harm. In other words, it would be better not to do any congressional censure or impeachment or an attempt to invoke the 25th Amendment, because a thing like that might spark something much graver than anything that we have seen so far. And that really, really struck me, David. One of my closest friends from long ago said, never back anyone into a corner from which they can only get out by coming over the top of you. And I think that's what John Bolton was saying, and that we are in for a kind of dicey period here before, let's say, March of 2021. So those comments really struck me. And you know what I was thinking when all this was going on? That if indeed we did do a program about this, and I felt that we must, that it might be fun to check in with a few of our favorite correspondents, and maybe beginning with Beau of Lynchburg, because he has been in a White House.
And we have Beau with us now. Hello, sir, and thanks for taking time to talk to us today.
Well, good morning. It's good to speak with you all.
Beau, in the least partisan terms you can muster, what happened yesterday?
You know, I think, and I'm going to try to use some Jefferson language here. We often talk, or I listen to you all on the Jefferson Hour talk about how the wellspring of our democracy is the Enlightenment values of reason and civil debate. And I think what we saw yesterday was an affront to that. It was an affront to our form of representative democracy that's been in place for almost 250 years. And, you know, what I can't stop thinking about are the millions of Americans who, in and out of uniform, have given their lives their limbs, their souls over the past several centuries to defend, protect, and sustain our democracy. And I think what we saw yesterday was their work, their memory trampled upon. We saw patriotism defiled yesterday in the halls of Congress. And I think it's a real tragedy, and it's a national shame.
I'm sure you watched a lot of this to the extent that you could. Some good things happened yesterday in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. It wasn't all bad, was it?
No, no. We not only saw two. I guess to sort of answer the direct prompt, I think what we saw yesterday in Congress, there were some bright spots, including that Congress reconvened after the mob rampaged through the Capitol for 4 hours. They reconvened and did what they were sent there to do, which is certify the state's results. And there actually was, I think we saw again, that some folks said enough. Fidelity to country is more important than fidelity to party. And I think that should give us some hope.
So after the Arizona debate occurred and everybody voted, and I was just shocked at how long it took for the House to vote under the COVID protocols. And I thought, this is going to be a long night. But then, of course, things really sped up. And then as we closed in on Pennsylvania, I thought, oh boy. And when Senator Hawley of Missouri raised his objection, my heart sank. And all I wanted to do was go to sleep. And I know that every single member of Congress, with the exception of Hawley, just wished they could go home. This thing wasn't ended until 4 a.m., and you knew that he was not going to prevail by adding 2.5 or 3 hours to the ordeal. I don't think he made a lot of friends in the Congress of the United States.
No, I don't think so either. I think that, as members of his own party, including Senator Cotton of Arkansas, stated, this was, I think, for those who, especially the 6 in the Senate, who voted to object, this was about furthering their own careers. I don't think that there's any other way to call it. I mean, it was not for principle. I think if you stand for principle, if you stand for sort of bedrock American principles, then there was no way that you could have in good conscience, to quote the Senator Loeffler from Georgia, you can't in good conscience vote to object, which I think is why you saw so many Republicans who had previously pledged to object to the certification after seeing the mob, realizing that there are real consequences to this type of rhetoric, pull back and adjust course, which was, of course, the right thing to do.
How do we have an inauguration at the Capitol of the United States in 13 days when the Capitol Police Force proved to be incapable of securing the Capitol for this minor moment?
I think it's a great question. I've been at previous inaugurations, and one of the things that strikes you is just the diversity of law enforcement. It's not just the Capitol Police securing the inauguration. Usually law enforcement agencies from across the federal government and surrounding states will usually participate. So I think we can expect certainly a beefed up presence. So my understanding is that the incoming administration is already planning on a fairly pared down inaugural. Anyway, though I think we don't know yet what kind of protests are planned, if any. But I expect that we'll see certainly a fair amount of vigilance that sadly we didn't see yesterday on Capitol Hill.
If I were Joe Biden, I might want to do this by way of Zoom.
I think so too.
David?
I just wanted to say thanks so much for taking a few minutes to talk to us today, Beau. And I know you spent a lot of time in Washington, and you have a love for that city. It must have broken your heart to watch that happen.
I almost, in talking about this with my girlfriend Emma last night, I choked up, and because I can't begin to express, I think, my outrage as an American at what we saw yesterday. Only a couple miles away, one thing I couldn't stop thinking about is that a couple miles away is Arlington National Cemetery from the Capitol. And there are tens of thousands of patriots who are buried there. And this is not what they fought for. This is not what they fought and died for. To watch representative democracy be so sullied. And so I grieve for what this means for them. And I grieve for our country. And I believe that we have to reject the vision that the mob, I think, brought to the Capitol yesterday. We got to do that firmly and decisively. You know, I know I'm sorry I'm speaking a lot here, but I really do believe that there are some unalterable, or as Jefferson might call it, inalienable moral truths. You know, that decency and integrity, generosity and honesty really are the bedrock of our country, and that they will, despite what we saw yesterday, that they will win out. You know, yesterday I think was a really dark day for our democracy. And while we'll be processing and trying to understand what happened for a long time, I just want to say that I don't think that we can let it deter us from what has made us a beacon on the hill to the rest of the world for 2 centuries, which is peaceful, fact-based, representative democracy. And I think that will continue, but I think tomorrow or yesterday demonstrates that we have to fight for it. We have to be prepared to stand up as citizens.
I absolutely agree with you, Beau. I'm going to remain a Jeffersonian optimist and say that January 6, 2021 marked a turning point. And I want to thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk to us this morning, sir.
Well, thanks to you both, and please stay safe and be well.
Bless you.
I was so pleased to hear him talk about Washington. I know you spent a lot of time in Washington. I've spent a fair amount of time. I lived there when I was just a kid, and then again when I was a younger man. And it is heartbreaking to think of what happened to those magnificent buildings, let alone the threat to the institutions.
It was a rough thing to watch, and I had several thoughts about it. And I apologize in advance for what I'm about to say, David, but for many of the people who broke into the Capitol and sat in Nancy Pelosi's desk or did paramilitary things in the House chamber or the Senate chamber, or who vandalized or stole things, broke glass, took seals, and so on. This is going to be for them one of the best days of their life, and they're going to regard themselves as having done a heroic thing in the manner of the Minutemen or the Green Mountain Boys or Jefferson's I Like a Little Rebellion now and then. That really, really depresses me. You saw people taking selfies. They think that they are part of a very deep and venerable American tradition of resistance to X, whatever X turns out to be, and that they place themselves with the people at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and to Paul Revere and Jack Jewett, and they quote Jefferson, I like a little rebellion now and then. They quote Jefferson, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. And they think that they are fulfilling an essential part of the American dream, not degrading it. And they honestly feel that. You know, I don't understand it, and I really fundamentally disagree with it. But this, I promise you, will have been not an embarrassing experience that they will regret having engaged in for most of them. It will be the highlight of what they regard their life as a free people.
You lead me into a question that I have been wrestling with, and I'll try to be as concise in asking you to comment on it as I can. But when there are disagreements in government, it's usually pretty clear cut. You know, it's we want to raise taxes. We do not. We want to send stimulus checks. We do not. But in this case, we have one side saying, we really fear for the future of our republic, and the other side saying, we really fear for the future of our republic. It's almost that definition of what the republic is supposed to be. And I think that is the issue.
I agree with you. That's precisely the point I'm trying to wrestle with myself. I got a call from a good friend of mine named Stephen from Western North Dakota this morning, and he said, I want you to do a program on Jefferson's Tree of Liberty, that kind of rhetoric. He said that's undoubtedly going to be on the T-shirt of some of the people who are in this rally. That's the sort of thing they will say if they talk to their local news entity. And he said this is an interesting streak in American history and American tradition. And of course, he's right. And the person who articulated that more than any other single individual in the founding generation was Thomas Jefferson. And so let me put it this way, David. I think there is a debate, sort of a struggle for the soul of identity in America between the Enlightenment and between these liberty obsessives. And when I say liberty obsessive, I am not necessarily saying that in a negative way. The Enlightenment's principle is, going back to what you just said, "Madam, I disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it." Or as Jefferson put it often in the course of his life, "We disagree, but let us disagree as rational friends." That's the Enlightenment principle of the thing, that democracy is where we debate things because otherwise we might be adjudicating them at the end of a musket. The other element is this sort of Green Mountain Boys idea, and this is deeply woven into these people. I mean, those people who attacked the Capitol believed in their hearts that they were doing something essential, that was an honored, fundamental part of what it means to be an American. These are Lee Greenwood's Americans. At least I know I'm free. And we have to try to understand that. And Jefferson bears some responsibility for that streak in American life. And this has always been the case, and it probably always will be the case. But it gets out of hand, as it did on this occasion.
You talked about Jefferson and his famous speech about the Tree of Liberty being refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots. We got an email from one of our listeners, Glenn Harris, this morning, referencing just that. He says, "I'm watching a group of citizens swarm the U.S. Capitol, breaking windows, halting Congress. The people swarming the Capitol are conservatives. The press and reporters are liberal. What's your take on this? Is the group of the people exercising their rights, or is it a criminal act?"
Well, it's a criminal act, of course. But they believe that they're exercising their rights and that the rest of us have gone to sleep or have been indoctrinated by creeping socialism or by complacency or by political correctness or by the establishment or by the deep state. And so their sense of righteousness, this is not a lark for them, although there was a lark element to some of it. This was not a lark for them. They, at their own expense, came from Montana or from Arkansas or from California to Washington, D.C., called there, by the way, by Donald Trump. They met in a rally where he and his son whipped them into a frenzy, and Rudy Giuliani actually said that it was time for combat. Donald Trump urged them to march on the Capitol. He said he would be with them. They believed that they were doing the right thing. They're not just there because this is like playing army in the woods over a weekend. For them, this is a deeply meaningful experience and a deeply American experience. And so that's what I think Jefferson bears some responsibility for. He's the wildest rhetorician per violence and rebellion of the Founding Fathers.
Indeed, I can't think of another that would have said something like that. We need to take a short break, but we will return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson. This week we've been discussing the events of January 6th, 2021. We had an extended conversation with your good friend, our Enlightenment correspondent, David Nicandri, that we're going to post on the 1776 Club site at jeffersonhour.com. I know we're going to talk to Joseph Ellis, but before we do that, can I just insert a bit of that conversation with Mr. Nicandri?
Of course.
Let's listen.
Good day, gentlemen. Glad to join you.
So, Dave, I know you were horrified by what transpired in the nation's capital on January 6th, 2021. Give us a sense of how you place this as a humanist and a historian.
I had a sleepless night last night. It was very troubling. I'm very concerned about the future of our country. On 9/11, 2001, a group of patriots on Flight 93 martyred themselves to prevent damage to the building that a bunch of our own citizens/hooligans produced and trashed yesterday. And I just, the profundity of that juxtaposition of people giving up their lives to protect that building and others just treating it so cavalierly, that juxtaposition was to me just shocking. And it just also brought back a lot of feelings of dismay and disbelief.
So I share your sense of agony, but then it turned out to be a pretty short-lived occupation. It symbolically is going to be more important than the actual damage that they did.
Yes, and I think it's important, Clay, to talk about how that was an armed insurrection. I think is over the top. It was certainly a riot. It was outrageous. It can't happen again. It could have been far worse. I mean, there are a lot of demonstrations, and I've seen them here at our own state capitol, where people are showing up with AR-15s, and there have been shootings on the streets of Olympia on back-to-back weekends in December of 2020 between the Antifa and the right wingers on the other sides of the street. So I think it's a bit much to say it was an armed insurrection, but it was extraordinarily troubling. So those are kind of my immediate reactions. If there's time, I'd like to go into why and how we got to this point, how we get out of this point in time. But I appreciate being able to kind of share my initial visual reactions to what I saw and heard of yesterday.
We would be fools not to ask you to do just that. So first of all, tell us how we got here.
We have too much power invested in the office of the presidency of the United States. These elections have become too consequential. Too much is at stake, the Supreme Court, and any number of things. And so, although it's unlikely because we seem to be heading in an authoritarian trend regarding that constitutional office, but I just would hope and pray that Congress can begin to see what's at risk by its devolution of responsibility to the administrative sector and bring back a lot of the power and authority. So that's the first thought I had. The second one, and the more deep-seated one, although both of these are long-term, is the breakdown in this country's liberal consensus. And I've shared some thinking about this with you, Clay. We wanted people with a sharper edge, a more critical view of things. And in fact, I think it's fair to say, looking back, that the New Left launched a cultural revolution in this country that was highly critical of tradition, conformism, cast an askance eye towards the very notion of patriotism, followed by its logical cultural successors, the modern progressive movement, postmodernism, where the very idea of objectivity or rationality is kind of dismissed as simply as a narrative construct. Nothing sets me off more than when I hear people talk about my truth. It's not your truth, etc. We are, I hope, at the very end of the American Thermadorian reaction to the cultural revolution launched in the 1960s and 70s. Now, this, of course, Clay, and you can expand and amplify as only you can. The Thermadorian reaction was the phase of the French cultural moment after the Jacobins and Robespierre were deposed in 1794. It was conservative in nature. It was, I think you could say, it was a populist movement representing a widespread disillusionment about that nation's governing institutions. This was all kind of turbocharged in the 1980s with the emergence of conservative talk radio, which was followed by Fox News Network. And predictably, entirely predictably, we saw those norms, as it were transmuted to CNN, MSNBC. Those used to be what I would consider bona fide news networks. Now all they are is the tribal antipode to conservative talk radio and Fox News, and those influences spread throughout our nation's media, newspapers, television, especially the internet. And so what we have in this country as a result of this are dueling outrage machines that they do nothing but inflame people. As I said earlier, they're monetizing anger. And when you have, I'm choosing my words here carefully, a largely uneducated populace with little sophisticated understanding of how they're being manipulated, you have circumstances like we find ourselves in. But that, in my estimation, Clay, is how we got to this point in time.
Outstanding insights there. And I want to say that this is the first time in the history of the Thomas Jefferson Hour that the word Thermador has been expressed. Congratulations on that. I really take your point about the rise of a certain type of media around the year 1980. I remember when I first heard Rush Limbaugh, and I was traveling in a car in Southern California in a rental car, and I heard him and I thought, this is a major voice that's going to rock this country, because whatever one says by way of criticism of Rush Limbaugh, he was a master broadcaster who developed an enormously potent persona. And, Nixon talked of the silent majority and Donald Trump speaks of the forgotten Americans, and they're both right, that there is a very substantial chunk of the American populace that never signed on to the liberal agenda. And I don't mean progressive liberal, but sort of the post-World War II agenda. And those people had very little vehicle to express their bewilderment, their perplexity, and their growing outrage. And suddenly, beginning in the 1980s, media came along to embody, clarify, magnify, and distort that sense of being left out of the equation. And I think that is a major phenomenon that has to be central to any understanding of where we are. Do you feel that's too strong a statement?
Not at all, Clay. I think, I felt this for a long time, but it's as if everything was crystallized yesterday. We are amidst, fearfully, a genuine Madisonian moment in this country. And I'm referring to his comments in Federalist 10, where he said, beware of factions actuated by, and I'm quoting here, actuated by some common impulse or passion. And I want to emphasize the word passion, Clay. Passion plays out at the expense of reason. Reason fuels thought, which leads to understanding. Passion is not thought. Passion leads to performative narcissism and outrage. But honestly, in my heart, Clay, I think this is the Federalist 10 moment right now, where we have these passionate factions, and they are truly putting the fate of the country in jeopardy. And maybe we can talk about how we get out of the present moment. But I think that is how we got here.
All right, then, Professor Nicandri, from that context, tell us where we need to go from here.
Well, I think suddenly Joe Biden has a opportunity for a truly meaningful presidency. If Biden can truly achieve a moment that obviates the Madisonian moment we're in, these passionate factions, and lead us to this sense of national solidarity where we concentrate on the common good. Rarely has a presidential inaugural address loomed as large, probably not since Roosevelt's in 1933. I think we have that kind of moment in front of us with Mr. Biden, and I hope he's successful in changing the tone of discourse in this nation.
Thanks, David.
Carry on. Thanks for calling.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.
David, before we talk to Professor Ellis, I'd ask you to play one more little piece from the discourse on the Senate floor. It struck me that, especially after the attack on the Capitol, a number of senators said, look, we're going to certify the election of Joe Biden, that we have to stop fooling around here. Even people who have objections to the election said, look, by the end of tonight, we're going to certify this. We have to do this. And I was struck by Lindsey Graham. So Lindsey Graham has sort of emerged as the enabler in chief of President Trump, almost a lackey figure that has almost sold his soul to golf with President Trump, has defended him at every turn. But he was about as stark as you can get, and you could see palpable relief and humor in the speech that he made on the Senate floor. I think he feels that he is pulled out from some cultish fixation he had on pleasing the President of the United States. Let's listen to just a piece of what he said.
I just think it's a uniquely bad idea to delay this election. Trump and I, we've had a hell of a journey. I hate it being this way. Oh my God, I hate it. From my point of view, he's been a consequential president. But today, all I can say is count me out. Enough is enough. But when this Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that they didn't violate the Constitution of Wisconsin, I agree with the 3, but I accept the 4. If Al Gore can accept 5-4, he's not president. I can accept Wisconsin 4-3. Pennsylvania, it went to the Second Circuit. So much for all the judges being in Trump's pocket. They said, no, you're wrong. I accept the Pennsylvania Second Circuit that Trump's lawsuit wasn't right. Georgia, they said the Secretary of State took the law in his own hands. He changed the election laws unlawfully. A federal judge said no. I accept the federal judge even though I don't agree with it. Fraud. They said there's 66,000 people in Georgia under 18 voted. How many people believe that? I asked, give me 10. I hadn't had one. They said 8,000 felons in prison in Arizona voted. Give me 10. I hadn't gotten one. There's problems in every election. I don't buy this. Enough's enough. We got to end it.
The Jefferson Hour is a public radio program and a podcast that attempts to look at the world around us through the lens of the humanities and American history and literature. That's what we do. And we try to take Jefferson and what Jefferson stood for and the world that Jefferson lived in and project it forward to give us clarity and context, a kind of a matrix that maybe allows us to understand the bewildering things around us better. And I thought that it would be really interesting for us to check in briefly today with Dr. Joseph Ellis, because he is as grounded in what the Founding Fathers had in mind and what they feared as anyone. Joe, one of our listeners wrote to me and said, to what extent is Jefferson complicit by all that wild talk about the Tree of Liberty and I like a little rebellion now and then? Is that streak in our culture in any way located in that posturing that Jefferson did about rebellion?
Yeah, Abigail used to say to him, yeah, it's neat for you to say that when you're in Paris and somebody over in Massachusetts is having their place burned down. And it's a legitimate question, I think. I mean, Jefferson trusted the people to behave themselves and to internalize a sense of honor and obligation to law, which some people regard, including Adams, as naive.
Remember what Jefferson said, Joe. You know, all those wild statements, but what he basically was saying was that the spirit of rebellion, even if irresponsible, is it reminds government of the truth that the people are sovereign, and it wakes everyone up to the real business of what it is to be free. And so we should be very charitable and not overreact to rebellion, because in a sense it's always a wake-up call, even when it's done for the wrong reasons.
He did think that, and Adams liked to say, where were you when they surrounded my house when I was president? 5,000 people were out there demonstrating, telling me that we had to go to war with France.
And he said, no doubt you was fast asleep in philosophic tranquility.
Exactly.
You've been around for a long time. I dare say you've never seen anything like this. On the other hand, we saw Kent State We saw the marches on Washington in the late 1960s. We've seen Ruby Ridge and Oklahoma City, and so on. I think presentism always is a mistake, that we think that this is so very unprecedented. How do you think this will be regarded 20, 50, 70 years from now? What happened yesterday, will they say?
Well, I think that, in fact, the law prevailed in the sense that the Senate and the House both then went into session and did the business they needed to do concerning the verification of the electoral vote. And unlike in a banana republic where, a dictator would have simply seized control, the principle of the law was followed and the election was verified. What do we call the guardrails held?
Joe, this is David. I'd like to interject just a bit of Jeffersonian optimism. I talked earlier with Clay, and I said that I was hoping that this would be a turning point, that we begin to repair things after the events of yesterday. You think I'm being too optimistic?
What I would call it is it's possibly an inflection point where we see the full implications of the confusion between opinion and fact. And I think that's a possibility. But I don't know. But right now, I cannot tell you that I'm confident.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for having me. The dogs now say it's time to go.
Okay.
We'll talk to you soon. We're so fortunate in the people who care about this program and agree to be occasional commentators and correspondents. Their insights have made us understand more about what we're living through at the moment. They have given us some lighter moments. There's some profundity and deep insight in what Beau has to say and what Joseph Ellis has to say and what David Nicandri has to say. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.